The air in the penthouse suite of St. Jude's private hospital was so clean it had no scent at all. It was the sterile, colorless smell of extreme wealth, a silence bought and paid for 27 floors above the city's clamor. Naomi, in her light blue scrubs that felt perpetually a size too big for her 18-year-old frame, moved through the quiet with a practiced gentleness. Her entire world had been reduced to the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor, the soft sigh of the ventilator, and the man lying motionless in the center of the sprawling room.
Kong Min-yoon.
A name whispered with fear on the streets she walked to catch the bus, but here, he was just a body under white sheets, a collection of tubes and wires, a blank canvas of a man. His face, even in its unnatural stillness, was a marvel of sharp angles and unforgiving lines, a testament to the power that now lay dormant. They had told her the job was simple: monitor his vitals, perform the daily regimen of care, and report any change. No questions. The pay was more than her mother made in 3 months, enough to keep their lights on, and then some. It was a lifeline she couldn't afford to refuse. But the silence was the hardest part. It was a living thing, a pressure that pushed in on her, so she had started to read. She brought a worn paperback from home, its spine cracked and pages softened with use. Tales of the Jaded Crown. It was a book of old, dark fairy tales her grandmother used to read to her, stories of sleeping kings and forgotten kingdoms, of loyalty tested by poison and betrayal. She would sit in the leather visitor's chair, angled so she could see both his face and the rhythmic green line on the monitor, and her low voice would fill the void. The king lay under a spell of endless sleep, she read, her voice a soft murmur. His enemies grew bold, believing the throne was empty. They did not know that, even in his slumber, the king could hear the whispers of his friends and the boasts of his foes. Her routine became a ritual, a secret liturgy performed in the temple of his stillness. In the morning, there was the careful bathing of his body, the tending to skin that remained unnervingly perfect, the passive range of motion exercises for limbs that felt like sculpted marble beneath her hands. He was an object of immense potential energy, a coiled predator held in stasis. She learned the landscape of him, the faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the intricate ink of a dragon coiling around his forearm, its scales disappearing beneath the crisp white cuff of his hospital gown. She spoke to him as she worked, her words filling the oppressive silence. "The physical therapist says your muscle tone is excellent," she'd murmur, flexing his hand. "Better than mine, probably, in the afternoons, after the doctors had made their brief, deferential rounds," she would read. The stories became their shared secret. She started to choose them specifically for him, for the silent, powerful man she was beginning to construct in her mind. She read of a betrayed general who feigned death to unmask his enemies, of a prince who navigated a court of vipers with nothing but his wits. She imagined she was arming him, whispering strategies and allegories into his subconscious. Outside the suite's heavy oak doors stood Hae-jin, a man who seemed carved from the same granite as his charge. He was Min-jun's shadow, his guardian, a silent sentinel whose devotion was absolute. Their exchanges were minimal, a slight nod in the morning, a quiet no change in the evening. Yet, in his dark, watchful eyes, Naomi saw the same fierce protectiveness she was starting to feel. One afternoon, while reading a passage about the king's most loyal knight refusing to abandon his post, she saw it. A muscle, tight and hard along Min-jun's jaw, clenched for a split second. It was so faint, so fleeting, that she thought she had imagined it. A trick of the light. But it had felt real, a tremor in the mountain, a sign that something deep within was still listening. The sanctum was breached on a Tuesday. The sterile peace was shattered by a presence that felt like grit in a gear. His name was Tae-woo, and he moved with the slick, overconfident swagger of a man who believed he was already a king. He smelled of expensive cologne that failed to mask a sour undercurrent of ambition. He barely glanced at Naomi, his eyes dismissing her as part of the furniture before they settled on the man in the bed. "Still dreaming, boss?" Tae-woo's voice was a sneer wrapped in false deference. He walked around the bed, his polished shoes silent on the floor, his gaze sweeping over Min-jun with a predator's appraisal. "The city gets restless. It needs a firm hand. not one that lies under a blanket. Heijin stood just inside the doorway, his posture rigid, his hands clasped behind his back. It was the only place Taewoo allowed him, a symbolic emasculation of the old guard's power. Taewoo leaned closer to Minjun's ear, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial poison. "They're starting to forget you. Your name is becoming a story they tell, not a command they obey. But don't worry. I will be sure to build my new house on the foundations of your old one." And he finally turned his attention to Naomi, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "And what about you, little bird?" Singing him sweet songs. He reached out and touched a page of her open book. "Be careful who you serve. Cages can be easily broken or locked from the outside." The threat hung in the air, cold and sharp. He gave Minjun one last look of utter contempt and swept out of the room, leaving a trail of charged, toxic silence in his wake. The heart monitor beeped on, steady and indifferent, a liar in the face of the violence that had just been committed. Naomi's hand trembled where it rested on the book. Taewoo's visit had changed everything. The room was no longer a sanctuary, it was a battlefield, and the man in the bed was the contested territory. A cold, fierce anger settled in Naomi's chest, displacing the fear. She looked at Minjun, at the still, proud lines of his face, and a vow formed in the quiet of her heart. Her duty was no longer just to his body, but to his legacy, to the sleeping power he represented. Her reading took on a new urgency. It was no longer a comfort, it was an act of war. She chose her stories like weapons. She read from The Tale of the Serpent's Tooth, a story about a regent who slowly poisoned the kingdom with lies while the true king was away, only for the king to return and demand a blood price. Her voice was no longer a gentle murmur. It had a new edge, a low, resonant intensity that filled every corner of the room. "And so the regent grew fat on stolen power," she read, her eyes fixed on Minjun's face, searching for another sign, another flicker of life. He paraded in the king's colors and sat on his throne, but the very stones of the castle remembered their true master and waited for his return. In the silence between chapters, she would speak to him, her whispers raw and desperate. "You can't let him do this," she pleaded, her hand hovering over his. "You have to wake up. He thinks you're gone. He thinks he's already won. You have to show him he's wrong. I need you to show him he's wrong." She was no longer a detached caregiver, a paid observer. She was an accomplice, a conspirator, a lone loyalist in a silent coup, whispering rebellion to a king only she still believed in. The light blue scrubs felt less like a uniform and more like armor, flimsy but determined. The fate of a kingdom she had never known rested on the pages of her book and the hope that he was listening. That night, a storm broke over the city. Rain lashed against the panoramic windows of the suite, and distant thunder rumbled like a restless giant. The atmospheric pressure seemed to have seeped into the room, making the air thick and heavy with anticipation. Heijin had been more tense than usual, his brief nod to her carrying the weight of 100 unspoken worries. Naomi felt the tension coiling in her own stomach. Taewoo was making his move, the whispers among the other staff, the anxious energy radiating from the guards on the floor, all pointed to a shift in power. She was exhausted, the long hours, and the emotional strain wearing her down. She sat in her usual chair, the book open on her lap. She had chosen the final story, The King's Awakening. It was about the moment of return, the climax of every tale she had read him. Her voice was barely a whisper now, a thread of sound against the backdrop of the storm. And in his darkest hour, she read, her throat tight, when all his enemies had gathered to dance on his grave, the loyal whispered his name. It was not a prayer, but a summons, a reminder. And deep within the stone and silence, the king heard. She traced the words on the page with her finger. Her eyelids were heavy. Without thinking, she let her hand fall to the bed, her knuckles brushing against the back of his hand on the starched white sheet. "He heard," she whispered again, to herself this time. And he answered, and then it happened. The world stopped. The rhythmic beep of the monitor, the drumming rain, the very beat of her own heart seemed to fall silent. His fingers, which had been cold and still for 3 long months, moved. They did not twitch. They did not spasm. They deliberately, consciously, closed around her wrist. The grip was not the weak grasp of an invalid. It was iron. It was absolute. It was the grip of a man who had just taken back control. Naomi didn't breathe. She couldn't. Her entire being was focused on the impossible pressure around her wrist, the undeniable strength in the hand that held her. It was a manacle of flesh and bone, anchoring her to a reality that had just been violently rewritten. Slowly, she lifted her gaze from their joined hands to his face, and she forgot how to think. His eyes were open. They were not the clouded, unfocused eyes of someone emerging from a long darkness. They were the color of obsidian, sharp and terrifyingly lucid, and they were fixed on her. The intelligence in them was a physical force, a piercing light that stripped away every pretense. The sleeping tiger was awake, and she was the first thing it had seen. The silence in the room transformed. It was no longer the empty silence of a coma. It was the charged, vibrant silence of a predator assessing its prey. Every sound from outside, the distant wail of a siren, the howl of the wind, seemed to fade into nothingness, consumed by the sheer intensity of his presence. He was the center of gravity, and everything, including the air she desperately needed, was being pulled toward him. He held her wrist for a long moment, a king holding a scepter, his thumb pressing lightly against a frantic pulse point. It was a message, a confirmation. He had been there all along. He had been listening to every word, every whispered plea, every story of betrayal and reclamation. He had heard it all. Then, with a slowness that was more intimidating than any sudden movement, he relaxed his grip. His fingers uncurled, but his eyes never left hers. The connection was not broken. He had simply changed the nature of their bond. She was no longer his keeper. She was his witness. His lips parted, and the sound that emerged was a dry rasp, the sound of a voice unused for 100 days, yet it held the deep, resonant timbre of absolute command. The storyteller, it wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a naming. Naomi could only stare, her own voice trapped in her throat. The man who was a myth, a ghost, a body in a bed, was looking at her, speaking to her. He shifted his head slightly on the pillow, a minuscule movement that seemed to require colossal effort, yet he did it with an unshakable will. His dark eyes scanned her face, not with confusion, but with a sharp, analytical focus. He was assessing her, weighing her, remembering the sound of her voice and connecting it to the face he now saw. "The jackal," he rasped, his voice gaining a fraction more strength. "How often does he visit my grave?" It took her a moment to understand. The jackal.
Tevo.
He had heard Taewoo's venomous monologue. He knew. Twice a week, she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. He was here today. Minjun's expression did not change, but a dangerous light flickered in the depths of his eyes. He had been using the coma as a shield, a vantage point from which to watch his enemies expose themselves, and she, unknowingly, had been his eyes and ears. He had judged her not by her actions, but by the stories she told. He had found her loyal. "Next time he comes," Minjun's voice was steadier now, colder. "You will send for him. Tell Heijin my signs are unstable. Let the jackal come to see the lion's last breath. Let him say everything he needs to say." He paused, his gaze pinning her in place. "Do not be afraid of him. Be afraid of what happens if you fail me. The dragon is not sleeping any longer." The next 48 hours were a blur of managed tension. Naomi performed her duties with a tremor in her hands that she prayed no one would notice. She was an actress in the most dangerous play of her life, and her audience was a single, terrifyingly awake man who pretended to sleep whenever anyone else was in a room. She followed his instructions precisely. She made a panicked call to the floor nurse, her voice convincingly frantic, reporting a drop in Minjun's vitals. The message was relayed, and as Minjun had predicted, it wasn't a doctor who answered the summons. It was Taewoo. He arrived within the hour, a vulture drawn to the scent of decay, a triumphant smirk already ghosting his lips. He dismissed Naomi with a wave of his hand. "Get out. I wish to have a final word with him." Alone, Naomi hesitated for a split second, her eyes darting to the still form on the bed, and received the faintest, almost imperceptible nod. She backed out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar, her heart hammering against her ribs. Heijin stood like a statue in the hall, his face an unreadable mask, but she knew he was listening, waiting. Inside, Taewoo's voice was a low, gloating murmur. "It's over, old man. The city is mine. Your kingdom is mine. Your name will be a footnote. I should thank you. By sleeping for so long, you made it all so easy." He moved closer to the bed. "I think it's time for this long sleep to become a permanent one." A little push is all it takes at that moment. Minjun's head turned on the pillow, his open eyes locking with Naomi's through the crack in the door. It was the signal. Naomi let out a sharp, terrified cry. As if shot from a cannon, Heijin burst through the door. But he was almost too late. With a speed that defied logic, Minjun's arm shot out, his hand clamping around Taewoo's throat, dragging the shocked usurper down onto the bed. The dragon was awake, and he was hungry. The aftermath was swift and silent. Heijin efficiently and brutally dealt with a gasping, terrified Taewoo, removing him from the room as one might remove a piece of trash. The door clicked shut, and an entirely new silence descended. It was not empty or tense, but filled with the profound, humming energy of reclaimed power. The beeping monitor seemed to sing a triumphant rhythm. Minjun pushed himself into a sitting position against the pillows. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it held no weakness. He was a king retaking his throne, even if that throne was a hospital bed. He looked at Naomi, who stood frozen by the door, her part in the play concluded. The man looking at her now was not her patient. He was something else entirely, something ancient and formidable. He gestured to the chair where she always sat. "Sit," it was a command, not a request. She obeyed, her legs unsteady. He watched her for a long moment, his obsidian eyes seeming to see straight through her, to the fear and the resilience warring within her. "You have a soothing voice," he said, the words no longer a rasp but a low, cultured rumble. It kept the nightmares at bay. He reached over to the small table and picked up her worn copy of Tales of the Jaded Crown, his long, elegant fingers tracing the faded title. "The king in your stories was saved by loyalty. A rare and precious thing." He didn't offer her the book back. He kept it, a trophy, a symbol of their connection. His gaze fell from the book and settled on her again, and this time there was a raw, undisguised possessiveness in it that made the air crackle. The line between patient and caregiver had been erased. The line between savior and saved had been blurred. Now, there was only one line that mattered, the one he was drawing around her. A day later, the transformation was complete. The medical equipment was gone, vanished as silently as Taewoo had. The hospital suite now resembled what it truly was, the temporary court of a king. Minjun was no longer in a hospital gown. He was dressed in a flawlessly tailored dark suit, the crisp white of his shirt a stark contrast to the dark ink that peeked from beneath his cuff. He stood by the window, looking down at the city that was now firmly back in his grasp, while Heijin stood by with a coat. The patient was gone. The predator was back. Naomi stood near the door, a ghost in her light blue scrubs. Her shift was over. Her job was done. There was no reason for her to be here, yet no one had told her to leave. She felt utterly out of place, a relic from a life that had existed only yesterday. He turned from the window, and his presence filled the room, dwarfing everything in it. He walked toward her, each step silent and deliberate, the fluid grace of a panther who had feigned sleep long enough. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from him, could smell the faint, clean scent of expensive soap and sheer power. He didn't offer her money. He didn't offer her a simple, "thank you." His dark eyes held hers, and she felt like a rare butterfly being pinned to a board. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gently tap the cover of the book he still held in his other hand. "The storyteller saved the king," he said, his voice a low, intimate murmur that was meant only for her. What does the king do with his storyteller now? Does he let her go back to the world that forgot her, or does he keep her and give her a new story to live in? Hey everyone, thank you so much for listening. What a ride, right? I have to know what you think Naomi should do. Does she run, or does she stay and see what this new chapter holds? Let me know your choice in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to find out what happens next, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. We have so many more stories coming your way. Thanks again for your support.